Before we dive into this wild ride, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Whether it's a sunny beachfront in Florida, a bustling market street in Chicago, or a cozy mountain lodge in Colorado. I love hearing just how far these Karen tales of chaos and karma can travel. The first thing I saw when I stepped out onto my balcony was blue. Not the cool, inviting blue of my pool on a summer afternoon, but a harsh, unnatural sapphire shade that clung to everything it touched. Dresses, hair, skin. It was as if someone had dumped an industrial vat of paint over an entire wedding party. Patricia and Cheryl were sitting waist-deep in the shallow end, their white dresses plastered to them, streaked with a hue so vivid it looked like a bad photo filter. Their faces were frozen in identical masks of shock and fury, strands of wet hair plastered to their cheeks. Behind them, their guests scrambled in silk gowns and tuxedos, their pastel fabrics now dripping dark blue, their shoes squelching as they sloshed to the pool's edge. Someone dropped a bouquet into the water. The flowers bobbed on the surface, petals already bleeding into the dye. I leaned against the balcony railing, coffee cup in hand, watching the scene unfold like the end of a movie. You're probably wondering how we got here. How two overbearing, self-proclaimed queens of a cul-de-sac ended up turning my backyard into the set of a failed avant-garde art project. The short version? They stole my pool. The long version? Well, let's rewind a bit. 3 days earlier, my life was relatively peaceful. I'd lived in this neighborhood for almost a decade. It wasn't perfect, no neighborhood is, but it was the kind of place where people generally kept to themselves, waved when they passed you on the sidewalk, and borrowed sugar when they were baking. I kept my yard clean, my fence painted, and my pool pristine. And then there were the Karen sisters, Patricia and Cheryl. They were about 40, unmarried, and according to them, the beating heart of the HOA. Patricia was the taller one, with that permanent pursed lip expression that made her look like she'd just sniffed sour milk. Cheryl was rounder in the face, with a voice like a squeaky door hinge that never quite closed. They dressed in loud floral prints, always with too much jewelry for a casual walk down the street. If the neighborhood had an official complaint department, they'd be it. Over the years, I'd had my share of run-ins with them. Patricia once left a laminated note on my door about the inappropriate length of my grass, when it was barely half an inch taller than the rest of the block. Cheryl had complained to the HOA about my mowing schedule, claiming that 10 a.m. on a Saturday was disturbing the peace. I learned to keep my distance, nod politely, and keep interactions as short as possible. That tactic worked until the text came in. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was in my office downtown when my phone buzzed. The message was from Dan, a neighbor 2 doors down. "Hey, saw some event crew in your backyard. You home?" I frowned, thumb hovering over the keyboard. "What do you mean, event crew?" The typing bubble appeared, then vanished. A moment later, "Looks like they're setting up for a party. Big one." My gut tightened. Nobody should be in my backyard. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, muttering apologies to my bewildered coworker as I left. The drive back was a blur of red lights and rising irritation. By the time I pulled up to my house, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted over my fence. I walked through the gate and stopped dead. White folding chairs lined both sides of my pool. A floral arch stood at the far end, draped in pastel ribbons and fake wisteria. Balloons bobbed gently in the breeze. A catering team was unloading trays of finger food onto long tables covered in lace tablecloths. And in the middle of it all, like the queens of some pastel kingdom, stood Patricia and Cheryl, each holding a clipboard. Patricia spotted me first. Her face lit up in the same way as snakes might when it sees a mouse. "Oh, there you are," she called, as though I'd been late to my own event. "We were wondering if you'd show up before the photographer." I stared at her, trying to find the words. "What the hell is going on?" Cheryl bustled over, adjusting a cluster of helium balloons shaped like hearts. "It's just a little bridal shower," she said breezily. "A little." I gestured at the scene. "There's 50 chairs here." Patricia's smile didn't budge. "We assumed you wouldn't mind. You never use your pool anyway, and this is a special occasion." "You assumed I wouldn't." I stopped myself, took a breath. You can't just take over someone's property. It's not really taking over, Cheryl said, her tone syrupy with fake charm. We cleared it with the HOA. This is a community goodwill event. That word, community, set my teeth on edge. Around here it was code for you don't get say in what happens to your own property. I don't care what you told the HOA. You have no right to be here. You need to pack this up. Now. Patricia exchanged a glance with Cheryl, then laughed softly, as though I'd told a quaint joke. Be reasonable. We've invited guests, ordered food, booked entertainment. Canceling now would be, well, rude. Something about the smug certainty in her voice made my blood run hotter. You've got 10 minutes to get out before I call the police. Go ahead, Patricia said, folding her arms. They'll tell you the same thing the HOA did. This is a civil matter. I didn't believe her until I made the calls. The HOA's response was almost word for word what she claimed. It's a harmless neighborhood gathering. We encourage you to be hospitable. The police dispatcher was polite but firm. Sir, that's a civil dispute. We can't get involved unless there's a threat of violence or property damage. By the time I hung up, the caterers were laying out crystal drink dispensers by the pool, and a man in a pressed suit was stringing fairy lights along my fence. I stood in my own backyard, watching strangers stroll around like they owned the place, and realized there was nothing I could do in that moment without escalating it into something ugly. Patricia walked by, sipping from a champagne flute. See? Everything's under control. Just relax and enjoy it. I didn't reply. I just turned and walked back into my house, closing the sliding door behind me. Inside, the muffled sounds of their preparations seeped through the glass. Laughter, clinking glasses, the rustle of decorations. I set my coffee cup down on the counter and leaned forward, my hands braced on the cool granite. All right, I thought. If you want my pool, you'll get it. But you won't forget it. The rest of that evening was spent at my desk, combing through my mental inventory of possibilities. The Karen sisters were confident, too confident. They believed I couldn't stop them, that they could waltz into my space, throw their picture-perfect event, and walk away without consequence. They were wrong. I didn't go to bed that night until after midnight. Outside, my pool glimmered under the string lights they'd left in place, casting ripples of pale gold across the water's surface. I stood at the window for a long moment, watching it, imagining it. By morning, the sounds of setup had resumed. Trucks arrived with crates of glassware and stacks of pastel cushions. I kept to myself, coffee in hand, watching from the balcony as Patricia barked instructions to a group of young men unloading equipment. Cheryl was already in what looked like a rehearsal dress, twirling in front of the arch as a photographer adjusted his lens. I could have gone down there. I could have tried one more time to reason with them. But I didn't. Instead, I took a long sip of coffee, went back inside, and started my own preparations. When the day of the bridal shower finally arrived, it felt like the neighborhood itself had been transformed. Cars lined both sides of the street, their doors spilling out guests in pastel gowns and press suits. The air buzzed with chatter and the scent of expensive perfume. From the second-floor window, I watched Patricia and Cheryl greet their guests at the gate, air-kissing cheeks and handing out champagne flutes. Every detail was meticulous. The white balloons tied in neat clusters, the pale blue table runners, the floral arrangements placed at perfect intervals around the pool deck. It was flawless. And it was all about to go spectacularly wrong. I slipped out through the side of the house, careful to keep out of sight. The hum of conversation masked the faint creak of the pool pump door as I eased it open. Inside, the familiar tangle of pipes and filters awaited me. My hand tightened around the small box I'd been keeping under my desk for days. I knelt, opened the box, and stared at the bottles inside. The liquid shimmered faintly in the light, harmless to skin, but absolutely merciless to fabric. I unscrewed the first cap. Outside, someone laughed, a bright, carefree sound, the kind people make when they think the day ahead will be perfect. I smiled faintly to myself. Perfect. And then I tipped the first bottle in. The liquid slid into the filter system in a smooth, unbroken stream, vanishing into the hidden veins of my pool. The chemical smell was faint, almost sweet, nothing that would raise suspicion. Bottle after bottle followed, each splash mixing invisibly with the water already circulating through the pipes. By the time I screwed the last cap back on, the dye was already working its way toward the main basin. I shut the pump door gently and straightened, brushing the dust from my knees. From here, I could see the tops of people's heads bobbing over the fence, hair neatly coiffed, hats tilted at stylish angles, sunlight flashing off sunglasses. The whole yard beyond my line of sight was buzzing with that kind of artificial cheer you only find at carefully curated events. The clink of glasses, the hum of polite laughter, the faint strains of an acoustic guitar drifting over the chatter. Patricia's voice cut through it all, sharp as a whistle. No, the macarons go by the punch bowl. Do I have to do everything myself? A few seconds later came Cheryl's higher-pitched reply, sweetened with fake hospitality. Oh, don't mind her, she's just a perfectionist. We want everything to be absolutely flawless today. I eased back into the shadows, slipping along the side of the house toward the patio doors. From inside, I could observe without being noticed, the glass pane turning the scene into a silent film. The guests milled about, their pastel outfits catching the sun. A young woman in a pale pink dress adjusted her hair before stepping to the pool's edge, angling for the perfect reflection shot. She leaned down, dipping her fingers in. For a moment, she froze, then looked down at her hand with a faint frown. But whatever she saw didn't register as alarming. She shook it off and moved to join a cluster of bridesmaids under the arch. The dye was doing its work slowly, like an artist layering color over a canvas, one transparent glaze at a time. From my vantage point, the water looked normal, maybe a little richer in hue if you really studied it, but nothing that would set off alarms. Not yet. Patricia appeared near the catering tables, resplendent in a short white bridal dress that clung like it had been tailored for her alone. Her hair was a stiff, sprayed wave, catching the light with every imperious tilt of her chin. Cheryl followed, dressed nearly identically, save for a slightly different neckline and more sequins than taste allowed. Together, they looked like some over-decorated pair of cake toppers come to life, each certain they were the star of the day. They worked the crowd with calculated ease, checking on food, arranging people for photographs, ensuring no one forgot for a second who was hosting this spectacle. Watching them, I could see why so many neighbors were intimidated by them. They didn't ask for permission. They assumed it had been given. They didn't push their way into control. They simply behaved as though they'd always had it. I sipped my coffee slowly, leaning on the kitchen counter, letting the scene unfold while the dye quietly transformed their stage. The official photographer arrived, a tall man in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, camera already in hand. He began arranging the bridal party along the poolside, giving instructions with a brisk, cheerful tone. Ladies in the front, gentlemen behind, yes, perfect. Let's have a few by the water for that reflection shot. Beautiful light today. I felt a ripple of anticipation. This was it. The moment the water would become part of the day's memories. One bridesmaid, a willowy woman in a pale yellow gown, stepped down into the shallow end, just enough for the hem of her dress to skim the water's surface. Her smile faltered. She glanced down, then at the others. Patricia noticed and laughed dismissively. Don't be so fussy. It's just water. You'll be fine. But the water wasn't just water anymore. Where the hem had touched, the fabric now carried the faintest tint of blue. Not enough to shock, not yet, but enough that in a few minutes, under the right conditions, it would deepen. More people moved toward the pool. Shoes came off. Dresses swished closer to the edge. One of the groomsmen crouched to splash his hands, flicking droplets toward a friend. Every movement stirred the water, blending the dye more evenly. The photographer called for a fun shot. Everyone in the bridal party lined up at the edge, holding hands, ready to jump in together. Patricia hesitated for only a second before agreeing. It'll be adorable, she declared, gesturing for Cheryl to take her place beside her. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. They jumped. The surface erupted into a kaleidoscope of limbs, fabric, and spray. The sunlight caught on the arc of water, turning it into a glittering curtain before it splashed back down. And then came the first scream. It was sharp and sudden, followed by another and another. The laughter that had started midair died almost instantly, replaced by shrieks of alarm. People scrambled toward the edge, slipping against the wet tiles. Dresses clung heavy to legs, dragging as they tried to climb out. From my place behind the glass, I watched the transformation in real time. The water, already deepening in color, had exploded into a saturated sapphire the moment it was disturbed. Skin gleamed faintly blue in the sun. Every pale gown and crisp white shirt now bore streaks of the same vivid stain. Hair dripped like strands of cobalt silk. Patricia's face surfaced, mouth open in a wordless roar. She pushed her wet hair back, eyes wide as she stared at her once pristine dress. Beside her, Cheryl's sequined bodice glittered an entirely new shade. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and rage. The guests looked from one another to the pool, then back again, as if the sight might make more sense on the second pass. It didn't. A man in a light gray suit cursed under his breath, trying to wring out his jacket. One woman held her skirt away from her body, watching the blue water drip onto the tiles in fat, heavy drops. Someone shouted about their phone. Another swore their shoes were ruined. The air filled with the chaos of 100 tiny disasters happening all at once. Patricia tried to restore order, barking for towels, demanding explanations, insisting it must be some kind of chemical reaction. But the harder she tried to control the scene, the worse it got. The catering staff hovered uncertainly, their trays of food untouched. The guitarist stopped playing entirely, watching with an expression that suggested he was filing this story away for every gig in the future. And then, inevitably, the phones came out. Guests began snapping photos and recording video, their blue-stained hands leaving smudges on their devices. Some laughed in disbelief. Others muttered about replacements and dry cleaning bills. The sound of camera shutters mixed with a low hum of whispered commentary, none of it flattering. I stayed where I was, my presence unnoticed behind the tinted glass. The die was doing exactly what I'd intended, not dangerous, not harmful, but utterly impossible to ignore. Every second that passed cemented the ruin of their carefully constructed image. Patricia finally spotted me. Her head whipped toward the house, eyes narrowing as they locked on mine. Even at a distance, I could see the accusation in her glare, the silent promise that she'd find a way to blame me for this. Cheryl followed her gaze, her expression twisting into something equally venomous. I didn't move. I didn't wave. I just met their eyes for a beat longer than necessary, then turned away, letting the curtain fall back into place. The noise outside swelled as more people realized the extent of the damage. Blue footprints patterned the patio. Streaks of color ran from hems to tile. The once pristine white balloons bobbed against their strings, splattered by the occasional flick of a wet hand. The floral arch leaned slightly, its lace ribbons trailing in the stained water. From the kitchen, I could hear Patricia trying to herd the guests toward the catering area, insisting they could eat and dry off. But her voice was fraying, every word edged with the panic she was trying to hide. Cheryl was nowhere in sight. I imagined her in the makeshift changing area they'd set up, discovering that nothing short of a full wardrobe change would make her presentable again. I took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and let the chaos unfold without me. Every ruined dress, every ruined photo, every memory of this day would carry the same blue shadow. They had wanted to make my pool the centerpiece of their perfect event. I'd simply given them exactly that, only in a way they'd never forget. The shouting outside shifted tone. It wasn't just outrage anymore, it was confusion. Someone was asking if the photographer could fix it in editing. Another guest was arguing that this was beyond repair. Patricia's voice cut through again, brittle with desperation. Just give us a minute to sort this out. I set my cup down, the ceramic clinking softly against the countertop. The worst was over, but the day was far from finished. The die had done its job, but the real fallout was only beginning. And I knew, as I stepped back toward the balcony door, that I wasn't done watching yet. Not by a long shot. The blue water dripped in steady streams from every guest, pooling in uneven shapes across the patio. The afternoon sun reflected off the puddles, casting strange, shifting light over the chaos. The once pristine bridal shower had collapsed into something between a farce and a disaster movie, and Patricia was standing at the epicenter. Her white dress now a splotchy mess of royal blue, her shoulders squared as if sheer willpower might hold the day together. Her voice rose above the din, commanding people toward the catering tables, telling them to grab food before it was ruined. But most guests didn't move. They stood in tight clusters, whispering, showing each other the stains on their clothes and skin. Phones were out in nearly every hand, cameras rolling, capturing not the idyllic celebration the sisters had planned, but the kind of viral moment that people would share for weeks with captions about the strangest wedding party in history. I leaned on the balcony railing, watching it all play out. No one up there could hear me, but I still couldn't resist speaking under my breath. "You wanted a centerpiece, Patricia. You got one." Cheryl emerged from the house, wearing an ill-fitting floral robe clearly borrowed from someone else's emergency bag. Her hair, still wet, stuck in awkward clumps around her face. She scanned the crowd with tight, jerky movements before finding Patricia. The two exchanged a rapid, whispered conversation, their faces shifting between panic and forced composure. Cheryl gestured toward the gate, and I guess she was suggesting they end things early. Patricia shook her head sharply, stabbing a finger toward the tables, as though sheer insistence might convince people to salvage the event. I stepped back from the balcony and into the house, picking up my phone from the counter. The video I'd recorded from earlier, the group jump, the splash, the instant screams, was just over a minute long. It was perfect. No extra commentary, no obvious signs of my involvement, just the raw moment of transformation. I uploaded it to my private account with a single caption, "When the neighborhood Karens steal your pool, but forget who owns the pump." By the time I returned to the balcony, the mood outside had shifted again. Some guests were leaving, their stained clothes clinging uncomfortably in the heat. Others stayed, seemingly more interested in gossiping about what had happened than in pretending the day could be salvaged. The catering staff began packing up trays of untouched food. The guitarist, having retreated to a dry corner, plucked aimless notes without commitment. Patricia caught sight of me again. Her glare was sharper now, her eyes narrowing into slits. She stepped away from Cheryl and started toward the house, her wet heels clicking loudly against the tiles. I didn't move until she was halfway to the sliding doors. Then I simply turned and walked out of view. I didn't lock the door, but I didn't open it for her either. Let her stew in that frustration. It was more satisfying than any shouted argument could be. The rest of the party dissolved in slow motion. People slipped out through the gate in pairs and small groups, the chatter soft but urgent, the kind of voices people use when they know they're talking about something scandalous. By the time the last guests were gone, only Patricia and Cheryl remained, their once grand decorations sagging under the weight of failure. They stood in the middle of the patio, surveying the wreckage. Blue-streaked tiles, wilting flowers, puddles of tinted water that were already drying into faint stains. Patricia's shoulders slumped for the first time all day. Cheryl bent to gather a few abandoned bouquets, stuffing them into a plastic bag. They didn't speak to each other as they worked, but their faces told the whole story. I waited until they'd finished loading the last of their supplies into Patricia's SUV before stepping outside. The sun was lower now, the light softer, and the pool, still glowing an almost unnatural blue, looked oddly peaceful again. I walked past them without a word, heading straight to the shallow end. Patricia turned sharply as if to confront me, but something in my expression must have stopped her. Cheryl simply climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door harder than necessary. The SUV pulled away a minute later, its tires crunching over the gravel. I watched until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did I let the grin spread across my face. Inside, my phone buzzed. The video had already racked up hundreds of views, the comment section filling with laughing emojis, incredulous reactions, and speculative neighborhood gossip. A few people recognized the setting immediately. One comment read, "This looks like our HOA queens. Karma's real, folks." Another, "The blue water's a nice touch. Hope it stains forever." By evening, the video had been shared to a local community page, then picked up by a regional meme account. The follower count on my once quiet profile started climbing in jumps. I knew it wouldn't take long before word reached Patricia and Cheryl that the footage was making the rounds. That thought carried a certain satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I got the confirmation. A flurry of HOA emails landed in my inbox, all written in the bland, overly polite tone of people who are scrambling to distance themselves from trouble. They stated that the association had not authorized the event and that any damage to private property would be the responsibility of the involved parties. In other words, Patricia and Cheryl were on their own. A few hours later, a delivery truck arrived at their house, unloading garment bags and boxes from what looked like a specialty cleaning service. I imagined the bill and smiled again. But that was just the beginning. The photographer posted a short update on his business page, explaining that due to unusual circumstances, the images from the bridal shower were irreversibly altered, and that he could not offer refunds for digital products already delivered. The accompanying sample photo, a candid shot of Patricia mid-sentence, dripping wet and dressed in streaky blue, was already being shared around. By midweek, I heard from Dan that multiple guests had demanded compensation for their ruined clothes. Some hinted at small claims court. Patricia and Cheryl, once the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcers, had gone quiet. No more porch gossip, no more barking at dog walkers for letting their pets too close to the curb. When I passed their house on my evening walk, the blinds were drawn, and their once pristine flower beds were going to seed. Still, I knew they wouldn't stay silent forever. People like them never do. They'd lick their wounds, rebuild their pride, and eventually try to reclaim their position. But they do it knowing one undeniable truth. They'd crossed the wrong person, and the price had been more than they'd ever expected to pay. The following Saturday, I spent the afternoon by my pool. The dye had faded back to its original clarity after a few filter cycles, and the tiles gleamed under the sun. I lounged in the shade with a cold drink, the air quiet except for the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street. For the first time in weeks, my backyard felt like mine again. As I closed my eyes, I heard the faint rumble of an engine. Opening them, I saw Patricia's SUV creeping down the street. She wasn't wearing her usual sunglasses, and her hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail. Cheryl sat beside her, staring straight ahead. They didn't glance in my direction, didn't slow down, just kept rolling until they turned the corner and vanished. I let the moment pass without reaction, sipping from my glass. But inside, I marked it down. They'd seen me, and they'd chosen not to engage. For now, the sun was dipping low when I finally stood, stretching, and walked to the edge of the pool. My reflection stared back, calm, content, entirely in control. Somewhere out there, Patricia and Cheryl were nursing their humiliation, replaying the day over and over, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. I knew exactly where. And if they ever forgot, well, I still had the pump.